December 19th, 1944, somewhere east of St. Vith. The forest was black with fir trees and frozen mist. Snow lay in the ditches in dirty folds, trampled by boots, tires, and the dragging heels of exhausted men. A German patrol moved through the wreckage of an abandoned American position with the caution of men who no longer trusted silence. There was the smell of pine sap, cordite, wet wool, and gasoline. One soldier lifted a torn field bag from the slush. Inside were biscuits sealed in wax paper, a packet of cigarettes, gum, chocolate sugar, powdered drink mix, and a little folding can opener that seemed almost indecent in its neatness. Beside the bag, half buried in snow, lay a green glass bottle with a red cap and a white script curving around the darkened glass. It was empty, but not old. Somewhere not far away, more Americans had been drinking Coca-Cola in the middle of winter, in the middle of war, and in that small, absurd object was a warning more unsettling than artillery. The bag said these men were supplied. The bottle said they were comfortable. The two together said something worse. The enemy did not merely have weapons, he had excess. That moment mattered because Nazi Germany had spent years teaching its soldiers to despise the United States as a civilization of softness, commerce, and trivial pleasures. Hermann Goering mocked American industry as fit only for making refrigerators and razor blades. Otto Dietrich, Hitler's press chief, sneered in 1942 that America had contributed nothing to the world but chewing gum and Coca-Cola. Such insults were meant to steady belief. Or they suggested that the United States lacked the hardness for continental war, that a people attached to convenience, sweetness, and mass consumption would crumble under blood, mud, and attrition. But hidden beneath the mockery was fear. Hitler himself understood that Germany had to win quickly before American industrial strength fully awakened. The Axis caricature of America was not just a joke. It was a strategic hope that abundance had made the Republic weak. The men who picked up American ration wrappers and Coke bottles in France or Belgium were touching the collapse of that illusion. The things they found were not luxuries drifting uselessly at the edge of battle. They were proof that American comfort had survived mobilization instead of being consumed by it. Yet the deeper shock was this. The bottle had come from the same system that made bombers, tanks, rifles, trucks, fuel cans, and Liberty ships. In 1940 and 1941, Roosevelt and the industrial planners around him had begun to turn the United States into what he called the arsenal of democracy. It was not poetry. It was a national reordering of steel, labor, transport, finance, and time. By war's end, American manufacturers had produced more than 96,000 bombers, 86,000 tanks, 2.4 million trucks, and 6.5 million rifles, while sustaining a vast home front economy at the same time. The miracle was not only quantity, it was simultaneity. America made engines and chewing gum, destroyers and refrigerators, canned rations and Coke syrup, all inside the same civilization of interchangeable parts, assembly lines, highways, unions, advertising, payrolls, and supply contracts. Germany, by contrast, still depended heavily on improvisation, scarcity, and distance-constrained logistics. So when a German infantryman found an American food packet and an American soda bottle together, he was not seeing two separate things. He was seeing the material grammar of a rival civilization, one that could convert factories into arsenals without ceasing to produce the habits of normal life. That is what was wrong. The enemy had not stripped itself bare to wage war. It had widened while fighting. American combat rations by themselves could already feel like a rebuke. The U.S. Army's C rations, improved from pre-war reserve food, offered canned entrees, biscuits, chocolate or candy, gum, and cigarettes, with roughly 3,700 calories when 3 meals were eaten in a day. K rations, designed for mobile operations and airborne troops, were lighter and more compact, but still carried meat or cheese, biscuits, confections, gum, beverage powder, with sugar, and even small non-food comforts. They delivered about 2,830 calories a day and were intended to keep soldiers moving during short, violent operations. American troops complained, certainly. They griped about monotony, about ham and lima beans, about cold meals and cans and mud. Yet even the complaints emerged from an army that expected organized supply to exist. German soldiers by late war increasingly lived in a harsher arithmetic. The Nazi regime had prioritized feeding its own military and sustaining the home front through seizure and diversion from occupied lands. but the entire food system began collapsing in the final year of the war under military pressure. Transport disruption, territorial losses, and systemic exhaustion. On paper, ideology had promised order. In the field, more and more men received delay, dilution, substitution, or nothing. So the abandoned American ration bag in the snow was not impressive because it was glamorous. It was impressive because it was standardized, sealed, and repeated millions of times. It represented a government and an industrial system that could promise a soldier not heroism, but regularity. And in war, regularity can look like magic. Then there was the bottle. Coca-Cola's wartime role was never merely sentimental, though sentiment gave it its power. At the outbreak of the war, Coke was already bottled in 44 countries, including states on both sides of the conflict. After the United States entered the war, Robert Woodruff issued the famous directive to see that every man in uniform could get a bottle of Coca-Cola for 5 cents, wherever he is and whatever it costs the company. It was an astonishing idea on its face, almost frivolous in the language of grand strategy, yet it fit perfectly into the American wartime imagination. The Republic would fight not only by asking sacrifice, but by exporting familiarity. It would not send boys overseas and ask them to become less American. It would send pieces of America with them: cigarettes, magazines, songs, baseball gloves, movie stars on posters, candy bars, and the curved green glass of a Coke bottle. To German eyes trained on notions of hardness, sacrifice, discipline, and deprivation, this could appear decadent. But decadence is wasteful softness, and this was something colder and more formidable. This was morale engineered at industrial scale. It was refreshment turned into logistics. It was an everyday pleasure put under the protection of shipping schedules, military cooperation, and manufacturing discipline. The bottle was not a toy traveling accidentally through war. It was a sign that American war-making included the deliberate movement of memory, taste, and normality. In June 1943, an urgent cable reached Coca-Cola from Allied headquarters in North Africa. Dated June 29th, it requested materials and equipment for 10 bottling plants, along with 3 million filled bottles and supplies for producing millions more every month. Within 6 months, the first plant opened in Algiers. It became the forerunner of 64 bottling plants shipped abroad during World War II, placed as near combat areas as circumstances allowed in Europe and the Pacific. By the end of the war, more than 5 billion bottles of Coke had been consumed by military personnel, in addition to countless servings dispensed through fountains and mobile units. That number matters not simply because it is large, but because it reveals the true scale of American production. 5 billion bottles meant sugar, glass, caps, labels, syrup, water purification, machinery, rail cars, ships, trucks, crates, mechanics, accountants, warehousemen, and officers willing to give cargo space to something that did not explode. Every bottle required a civilization of repetition behind it. To a German soldier staring at a discarded Coke bottle in the Ardennes or on a French roadside, the object may have looked trivial. In fact, it had crossed oceans, ports, depots, roads, and battle zones. It had survived the same war that consumed men. It was a liquid footnote to a gigantic industrial sentence. Coke even created its own strange military caste. Technical observers, civilians in uniform-like dress, treated as commissioned officers for practical purposes, were sent overseas to establish and maintain bottling operations. Soldiers nicknamed them Coca-Cola colonels. More than 200 company employees helped build and maintain the system, and 3 were killed in the line of duty. Some units in the Pacific used improvised mobile dispensers, the so-called jungle fountains, so that even men in remote and brutally humid outposts could drink Coke cold. It sounds almost absurd, which is precisely why it mattered. The system violated the old European assumption that hardship itself was a measure of seriousness. American war production seemed capable of carrying not only gasoline and shells, but unnecessary things, and then revealing that they were not unnecessary at all. A cold drink after mud, heat, dust, or fear became part of the architecture of endurance. This was not softness replacing discipline, it was comfort supporting it. German soldiers were used to seeing the front strip life down to what was indispensable. Americans kept finding ways to redefine the indispensable. The bottle persisted because someone, somewhere far behind the line, had decided morale was also a supply category. The emotional force of Coke for Americans is preserved in wartime letters. One V-mail excerpt recalled a soldier's amazement at receiving bottled Coca-Cola overseas just when he believed he would not see it again until home. Another letter from Paris described a soldier returning from a newly opened Coke bar and admitting, almost sheepishly, that he would rather have the Cokes than the beer. Such lines are valuable because they show what the bottle meant from the inside. It was not important because it was luxurious. It was important because it collapsed distance. The curved bottle in the hand was not merely a drink. It was the corner drugstore, the nickel price, the bright plate glass of small-town America, the certainty that somewhere beyond the shell fire, there still existed a civilian rhythm untouched by ruin. For American troops, Coca-Cola was memory made cold. Now, for Germans encountering its remains in the field, it meant something more ominous. It suggested that the enemy's rear areas were intact enough, organized enough, and confident enough to preserve nostalgia while conducting mechanized war across continents. That is a very different kind of power from fanatical discipline. It is the power to make distant men feel connected to a whole society rather than abandoned by it. And the bottle did not arrive alone. Behind it came the convoys. After the breakout from Normandy in the summer of 1944, the Allied advance moved so fast that supply threatened to fail beneath its own success. Rail networks had been damaged, ports were limited, armies were outrunning their depots, so the Americans improvised on a grand scale. On August 25, 1944, the Red Ball Express began hauling petroleum, oil, lubricants, your ammunition, food, and essential stores forward along restricted one-way routes across France. It operated day and night for 82 days. At its peak, it used thousands of trucks, and by the time it ended in November, it had moved 412,193 tons of supplies. Roughly 3/4 of its personnel were African-American soldiers, men who performed some of the hardest and least celebrated labor in the European campaign. Drivers pushed through fatigue, blackout conditions, damaged roads, weather, mines, and the constant mechanical attrition of heavy vehicles working without pause. "Keep 'em rolling" was less a slogan than a physiological command. The German army, so often imagined after the war as wholly mechanized lightning, still relied heavily on horses and strained transport. The Americans answered movement with more movement. And somewhere in those truck columns, mixed with drums of fuel and cases of ammunition, traveled the components of a world that seemed indecently plentiful to anyone trained by scarcity. The scale of transport at sea was just as decisive. Henry Kaiser's shipyards and other American facilities transformed merchant shipping into an industrial torrent. Liberty ships were standardized cargo vessels, plain and ungainly, but they were produced in numbers that turned the Atlantic and Pacific into supply roads. More than 2,700 Liberty ships were built during the war, carrying ammunition, grain, vehicles, spare parts, and every imaginable burden of modern conflict. They were not glamorous warships. They were the patient hulls of abundance. On paper, a Coke bottle or a ration tin or spare tire was small. In practice, when such objects only existed at the front because shipbuilders, dock workers, rail crews, depot clerks, truck drivers, and quartermasters formed an immense relay. The American system did not depend on one dramatic stroke. It depended on uninterrupted transfer. Cargo became campaign. That is why the bottle mattered. A bomb can destroy a bridge in an instant, but a drinkable soda in a foxhole means the whole chain behind the bridge has been repaired, rerouted, or replaced. It means industry has achieved not only production, but continuity. For the German soldier, this created a brutal emotional contrast. Many had been raised inside a political culture that glorified hardness and sneered at comfort. They had been told that democracies were indecisive, indulgent, and spiritually weak, that mass culture produced softness, that consumer goods belonged to a civilization of shop windows rather than battlefields. They expected, if they faced Americans, to meet wealthy amateurs, cushioned by distance, and protected by machines they themselves did not truly understand. Instead, they found an enemy who could eat from standardized ration packs, replace losses with alarming speed, move armies by road over impossible distances, and still leave behind signs of leisure. The American soldiers seemed from one angle almost unserious, chewing gum, carrying comic strips, craving ice cream, hunting cigarettes, talking about movies, writing home about Coke bars. But from another angle, the same soldier appeared attached to a machine too large to wear out. The can opener, the chocolate bar, the sealed biscuit packet, the truck convoy, the full fuel drum, like the green bottle in snow. Each was trivial alone. Together, They were a philosophy. Not the philosophy of noble deprivation, not the philosophy of the chosen elite, a philosophy of scale, repetition, and confidence. A democracy had discovered that comfort could travel with violence, and that discovery altered the psychology of the battlefield. This did not mean American supply was perfect. It was not. American forces had shortages, delays, breakdowns, waste, and confusion. The Red Ball Express itself was born from crisis. K-rations were often unpopular and not calorically sufficient for extended use. Bottling plants had to compete for shipping space against military necessity. Even the famous promise of a 5-cent Coke had to contend with rationing, cargo priorities, and distance. Yet this is precisely why the evidence is so powerful. Right? The system did not need to be perfect to be overwhelming. It needed to be resilient. German experience by late 1944 and 1945 was increasingly one of narrowing margins. Less fuel, fewer replacements, fewer certainties, more improvisation. American experience, despite friction and complaint, was one of recurring replenishment. The Coke bottle became symbolic because it stood beyond necessity. Shells and bullets prove an enemy can still kill. Coke proves he can still smile. And an enemy who can preserve morale in that way may also preserve cohesion, patience, and belief. The bottle also carried an ideological insult of a subtler kind. The Third Reich preached a total state. It promised to subordinate everything to national power, to fuse politics, economy, youth, labor, culture, and war into a single historical will. Yet when the war deepened, the Nazi food system frayed, shortages spread, and coercion increasingly filled the gaps. Meanwhile, the United States, a noisy commercial republic full of arguments, private companies, unions, advertisements, elections, and regional contradictions, generated a form of total production without becoming a formally totalitarian state. That contrast was devastating. The Coke bottle, born in commerce and branded in flowing script rather than martial runes, could appear at the front because millions of free or semi-free transactions, contracts, labor decisions, design choices, and managerial adaptations had been harnessed toward war. Even America's inequalities and hypocrisies, visible in the segregated army and the unequal home front, did not prevent that system from producing results at immense scale. And it is one of the paradoxes of the war that African American labor, so often denied full dignity within the nation, proved central to sustaining the movement of a democracy abroad. The bottle, then, was not merely sugar water. It was a civilian object carrying the energy of a sprawling, contradictory society that somehow remained productive under stress. There is another reason the image stayed with those who encountered it. Glass is fragile, but industry had made it common. That matters symbolically. German military culture had long revered steel, helmets, guns, tracks, discipline, hardness. Coke came in glass, transparent, breakable, reflective glass. And yet the bottle kept arriving. It crossed oceans in crates, stood upright on trucks, rattled in depots, clinked in mess areas, and endured the handling of war. What it brought with it the sound of normal life, a light, ringing knock of bottle against bottle, so different from the metallic violence that defined the front. One can imagine how uncanny that sound would have seemed in ruined France or Belgium. Not the scream of incoming rounds, not the crack of Mauser rifles, but the civilized clink of refreshment. A small domestic sound surviving among amputated trees, shattered stone, and burned vehicles. It was almost offensive. War had stripped Europe down to hunger, smoke, and rubble, and yet America had found a way to import the soundtrack of a drugstore. In many places, local civilians also tasted Coke for the first time because of these wartime bottling operations. Coca-Cola itself later described the drink as becoming, after the war, a symbol of friendship. There is a corporate optimism in that phrase, but also truth. The bottle that rolled forward with U.S. troops did not vanish at the armistice. The wartime plants remained as the skeleton of post-war expansion. From the mid-1940s to 1960, the number of countries with Coke bottling operations nearly doubled. What had arrived first as morale and commerce stayed as habit. When war ended, a little bit of American daily life remained in the liberated and occupied spaces of Europe and beyond. This is not to romanticize occupation or to confuse branding with virtue, but it does reveal how profoundly material culture can outlive armies. Germany had tried to dominate Europe through terror, racial empire, and organized plunder. The United States left many things behind, some noble and some troubling, but among them was a consumer language tied to plenty, repetition, and ordinary choice. The bottle outlasted the battle because it belonged to a wider ecosystem than military command. For some Germans, whether at the front, in captivity, or amid defeating weapons, but wars are also decided by recurring ordinary things, by whether bread arrives, by whether tires fit, by whether fuel reaches the engines before the engines outrun the map, by whether exhausted men feel forgotten. And the Coke bottle matters because it belonged to that hidden republic of recurrence. Somewhere in America, a worker filled it. Somewhere else, another worker packed it. A ship carried it. A depot counted it. A truck hauled it. A cooler held it. A soldier drank it and tossed it away. Then a German soldier lifted it from the snow and, in that curved glass, glimpsed the industrial horizon of his enemy. Not a romantic enemy, not a mystical enemy, but one horrifying in its banality, a civilization so productive it could make sweetness part of strategy. And that is perhaps the larger truth this image leaves behind. Freedom does not always appear in marble speeches or on battlefield maps. Sometimes it appears as the capacity of an open society, imperfect, noisy, commercial, argumentative, to generate more than destruction. To make rifles, yes, but also lunch kits. To build bombers, yes, but also bottling lines. To send soldiers into terror and still insist that they remain connected to a life beyond terror. Nazi ideology worshipped hardness because hardness was all it. Encounters with American abundance could become ideological abrasions. The war did not instantly convert men. A ration bag does not erase belief, and a soft drink does not dissolve fanaticism. But repeated contact with the material facts of Allied production could undermine the myths on which Nazi confidence had fed. What did it mean if the supposedly decadent enemy could outbuild, outship, outfeed, and outlast the harder race? What did it mean if an army nourished by movies, jazz, advertisements, trade unions, civilian abundance, and political argument could carry its comforts into the furnace of Europe without collapsing? A single bottle could not answer those questions, but it could force them. And once the question entered the mind, ideology had to labor harder to keep its shape. Totalitarian systems depend partly on insulation. They need their followers to inhabit a sealed world of explanation. Sometimes history breaks that seal, not with revelation, but with inventory. So the abandoned ration bag and the Coke bottle in the snow become, in this story, more than relics. The bag represents the American promise of organized provision. Calories, sugar, cigarettes, small mercies, all counted and packed. The bottle represents something the German soldier had been taught to despise and therefore struggled to interpret. Abundance without visible exhaustion, comfort without surrender, consumer pleasure aligned with military purpose. The two together form a kind of battlefield equation. One says the American army is fed. The other says the American system has surplus after feeding it. One says this enemy can sustain combat. The other says he can sustain morale, identity, and memory while doing so. And if a nation can deliver that to millions of men overseas, then it has solved a problem larger than tactics. It has solved endurance. There is a temptation in war history to make everything hinge on genius, courage, or annihilate could finally guarantee. American democracy, for all its flaws, revealed another kind of strength, the power to multiply the ordinary until the ordinary itself became strategic. A bottle of Coca-Cola did not win the war, but the world that could place that bottle beside a ration bag on a frozen battlefield was the world that would. And when the glass caught the pale winter light, it reflected the end of one vision of history and the stubborn survival of another, the belief that abundance, routine, and even small pleasures may belong not only to peace, but to the side fighting to restore it.